Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another edition of Beyond the Album Cover with yours truly, Jarrell Mason, where we get inside the entertainment industry with those in the know and give them their flowers. Why are they here to be celebrated? With me right now, I have a cultural critic, music writer based in the Empire State, New York City. She released in 2020 a book about the history of boy bands, Larger Than Life, a history of boy bands from NKOTB to BTS. And we know for sure she got the right stuff and she wants it that way. Ladies and gentlemen, let's give a big round of applause and thank you for coming on to the podcast, Miss Maria Sherman. Maria, thank you for coming on.
Oh my gosh, can you be my hype person forever? I feel like I need to wake up to that. That was amazing. Thank you so much.
Oh, sure. I could definitely put that on your voicemail for you for a small fee because in the Fat Joe, today's price is not yesterday's price. So we'll talk about that offline. But let's jump right into the interview. So what led you to want to become a writer, and where did your fascination of boy groups come from?
Yeah, those are good questions. I actually knew I wanted to be a music writer specifically, or I should say journalist, right? I'm not a songwriter. That is not a dream I've ever had, and there's no talent to back it up. So I'm glad I didn't go down that path. But I knew I wanted to write about music since I was like 11 or 12. And that just kind of came from, reading my dad's old Rolling Stones and like kind of developing my own musical taste and realizing that music could be an identity for me. It's how I could like relate to other people and make friends with them. I also grew up like a military brat, so I moved around a lot and I spent a lot of time in Germany, and it was kind of cool to see how like liking the same artist was like a shared language, even if you like can't completely communicate with people in a different culture, a different country, different continent. So I sort of knew early on, and then my entire life became, okay, get out of high school so I could go to a good college, get to a good college and become a music journalist. Of course, there's so many avenues and ways in which to do it. There's some of the most brilliant people I know in this field, like didn't go to school, did alternative paths and, made it work. But for me, my parents are pretty traditionalist, and that was sort of my path. I got to New York City, started interning, really kind of became a showman, was networking with everybody, really just trying to prove my worth, and eventually got some jobs, got some bylines, and that's kind of how it all started. My interest in boy bands specifically kind of came a little bit later. As a kid, I really liked Backstreet Boys, and then like through my mom, like Boys to Men, of course, which is like Backstreet Boys wouldn't exist without them, and we could certainly get into that kind of stuff. But I kind of abandoned them for rock music because it was just sort of, I'm 30, and I think for like my age group, there was a time period in our adolescence where like pop punk and emo and that kind of stuff was the big popular music on like MTV's TRL and stuff. And that became my focus. And it wasn't until college where I decided, hey, I still love pop music. This is like One Direction is back and big. And then there are also these other sort of underrated boy bands that are trying to like make it like big time rush a little bit, but like Mindless Behavior and all these like R&B like boy groups. And I was thinking like, I really love this music. Why can't I write about it seriously or critically? And then I kind of realized, oh, it's because the way that we talk about this music is still very gendered, where there's this like image of the hysterical fangirl who's like screaming and losing her mind and crying and like wetting her underwear. She's so excited. She's a monster almost. And I found that to be kind of silly. And so I was like, you know what, I'm going to take this thing that I love very seriously and, sort of see what comes of that. And then, a couple of years later, I'm writing a book. So it worked out.
Right. Definitely a great piece, fascinating read, and very animated in terms of drawings, put you in the mind of a comic book. But it's funny how you mentioned the stereotypical boy band profile and how in the movie Turning Red, Billie Eilish and her brother Phineas definitely studied NSYNC and Backstreet Boys catalog with Four Town.
Oh, they absolutely did. And it's kind of crazy because I remember watching the credits the first time I watched the movie with my partner. And I was like, I felt like that was a good like Backstreet Boys ballad, but right now there would be a key change. And then when you hear the full song, there was a key change. Like everything about like what they do is so specifically it's formulaic, but it's because the formula works, right? It's like, there's the idea of like pop music having a certain math to it. And they nailed it. And that movie is so fun. And also something I think that can only have happened contemporarily, where we're like, oh, we can sort of like poke fun at this stuff, but we can also tell the story of like a young girl, especially a young girl of color, kind of coming into her own in middle school. I love that movie. Obviously, I'm a fan for a lot of reasons, but they do the boy band story well. They do it justice for sure.
Yeah, they did it fairly well because that was my childhood era, middle school, high school, Backstreet Boys, NSYNC, LFO, 98 Degrees, O-Town, that whole phenomenon. And you could tell they studied TRL very well, and how for these group of kids, NSYNC was how my generation looked at Jackson 5 or the Osmonds.
Yes, yeah. Oh, and I love that you brought up the Osmonds because I feel for in some weird way I feel like they kind of get left out of the story a little bit. I think maybe because of honestly Mormonism, and we don't really like to talk about religion in like pop music a lot, or at least like that kind of stuff. But yeah, it's every I like to tell everybody that like every generation kind of gets their own one of these bands. Like it never goes away ever since people realized one that like girls love boys who sing in harmony and like wear cute outfits and do the whole thing. And we do have the Jackson 5 and those groups, the Temptations, the Four Tops, all these groups to thank for that, Motown specifically. And then two, that you can make a lot of money off of that. So you know what, like BTS just said that they are like taking a break, but you know, it's not going to be long before there's another like group of young men that write some or perform some catchy songs that we all love.
And if we take a look at the modern day boy band craze from Boston, Massachusetts, and Washington, D.C., New Edition pretty much laid the template for the modern day boy group. And I had a chance to interview Maurice Starr and Brooke Payne and to kind of hear from them from the horse's mouth, New Edition's beginnings, and then seeing the miniseries and how 1978 they were just performing locally in talent shows in and around Boston, and then 4+ years later they're changing the face of the pop industry. And then later on from Dorchester comes New Kids on the Block, which pretty much took what New Edition did and just exploded it onto the pop side. But now I interviewed Danny Wood, and Danny made it clear from day one that they looked up to New Edition. New Edition was the template. They always let it be known, no New Edition, no us.
Yes, damn, you could write my book. Why did I do it? You could do you could have done it. Yeah, that's all amazing. And I'm also very jealous you got to speak to Maurice Starr. I would love to talk to him. Yeah, I think one thing that's interesting is like a lot of boy bands, I even in like interviews, you'll notice like throughout the years, different generations, eras, they'll always kind of like hype up the groups that came before them, but say like they're very different or whatever. I've always loved that New Kids on the Block has always been like, it all comes from New Edition. They've always been like, this is the template. This is where the form comes from. And I agree with that in a lot of ways. I really think that like, we don't really see the word boy band like in music history or whatever until the 80s. And I think a lot of that is like, it's related to New Kids on the Block becoming the sort of like global phenomenon that it did, but it's really New Edition. And I would also say Menudo in Puerto Rico that kind of created that form that like creates the ripple that follows, right? Because it's like we do have Motown, we do have the Beatles, we do have the Osmonds, as you mentioned, all of these things that I think are like proto boy bands, but it's really like New Edition that's like, this is the first. And there are a lot of things that didn't allow them get to the size of New Kids on the Block, for many reasons, race being the most obvious one, but then also like different, like, you know, internal dilemmas and stuff with Maurice Starr and all that kind of stuff. But they really are like the template. They are the foundation for sure.
Right. And whatever group do you know of where all the members had even bigger success solely, come back together, have more success as a group, and is still standing 40+ years later. And Michael Bivins discovered one of the best-selling male pop groups of all time, Boyz II Men, which comes from the New Edition tree.
Yeah, absolutely. Have you seen the BET like docuseries on New Edition that came out a couple of years ago?
Yeah, I definitely saw that, and I'm a huge New Edition fan, so I paid close attention to make sure that they got everything correct, and they hit it out the park with casting, with the songs, and it was just overall a great miniseries, and it showed people outside of, let's say, African-American culture that knew what we've been knowing since '83, that New Edition is an institution, is a brand, And the next thing up for New Edition, I feel, is the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. So Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, if you're on the voting committee, vote for New Edition, please and thank you.
I 1,000,000% agree. And they should be in there. It's a crime that they're not. I do get a vote, so I'm like I'm I'll send an email. I want him in as well. Yeah, but that series I thought was so good. It's like maybe one of the better music docu because it's so hard to really do these stories justice, because I think people kind of get so, especially in like what we're talking about, like boy groups or like vocal groups or whatever, because there's such a history of like exploitation and like money grubbing and all these sort of like cautionary tale type things, especially in the New Edition story. And like it's so hard to do those things well and generously while also highlighting like they laid the foundation, they are the first, they did all these things, and they did such a good job. I mean, like that miniseries is like my Elvis movie, you know, like I just thought they did such a great job.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I want to touch back on New Kids for a quick second, kind of refer back to my interview with Danny, because that was done a year before The Block and before they got back together, and how a lot of people still don't understand that New Kids came up as an R&B group. They were put together to win over the R&B consumer. Please Don't Go Girl was marketed as an R&B record, and they did a video that was initially only seen on BET, but it was only until a pop station out of Florida started playing it that Columbia started getting requests for ads on pop radio. And then, as we all know, the rest is history, and pop radio took a hold. But New Kids never forgot their R&B roots, and it was evident on the Face the Music album. But Danny stated that, hey, everything we didn't do was pop. So it was kind of weird once the pop train got behind us, because we felt we were an R&B group at the core. And I think people just took everything out of proportion once Hanging Tough and Step by Step just went massive.
Right. That's exactly right. And I think it's a good thing to highlight that. Like Face the Music, I think is good too, because it's like when you have a band that like before, like, you know, Jonathan left and there's like a moment where there's like, it seems like maybe the group is fracturing or something's happening. There's going to be pivotal change and they're choosing to go back to the roots or choosing to go back to R&B. Then you know that that's where their heart is. Like that is the music that they love most on this planet. Like they were huge fans of Maurice Starr before even like, you know, being kind of brought together by him, you know, after New Edition. So it really shows like what they were into musically, that they were like educated in that music too, also growing up in Boston, and you know, some of them can dance unlike some other boy bands you can talk about in history. They really knew that music, and they loved that music, and they were pulling from that music in a way that feels really sort of authentic. And like I honestly think that's probably one of the reasons why, you know, they're still touring. And they're on that tour with like Salt and Pepper that looks insane, that I would love to go to. And they're doing it because they truly love it. And they're, you know, they're one of the greatest.
Yeah, I caught the mixtape tour about 3 years ago when they were in Vegas. It was them, Salt and Pepper, Naughty by Nature, Tiffany, and Debbie Gibson. And it was a great show. You wouldn't be disappointed. It felt like soccer moms, stay-at-home moms were living their childhood youth, probably taking the posters off of their walls, the buttons, dusting off the dolls from the attic. And it was just a way to escape and relive when times were a little simpler. But I want to deviate real quickly for a minute. Do you think the Beach Boys would be considered by definition a boy group?
See, I really it's funny. I wrote this book, but then I feel like my definition changes day to day, or how people like discuss something like this. I like, my gut reaction is to say no, primarily because they are obviously like, you know, come from a vocal group tradition or performing secular songs, but they're also instrumentalists and they have a lot of fans, but their fans are a lot of mixed like gender dynamics. Like so much of what a boy band is really hard, or a boy group rather, I think is kind of hard to define, but you sort of know based on its audience, its legacy, how it's been discussed in the media, how it's marketed. And I feel like maybe Beach Boys are a little outside of that. However, if you have an argument for me about why they are, sometimes I'll agree, because I think that's what's so fun about this, is because there is such a tradition that we can pull from, and we can see like with each decade, each generation getting their own, but then there's so much like flexibility and like malleability and like what we decide a boy band is. Because, you know, some people tell me like Boyz II Men aren't a boy band because or a boy group, whatever you want to say it, because their songs are more mature. They come from a more specific R&B tradition. I think a lot of it is marketing, that like they obviously weren't treated like a thing for young girls and children like Backstreet Boys were, what have you. And there are a lot of reasons for that, of course, that we could get into, but it's a little complicated, but I'm interested to hear your opinion.
I think Beach Boys, if you look at their earlier catalog, like Surfing USA, Surfer Girl, definitely in the
Yeah.
vein of a boy group. But then once they hit Pet Sounds, that was when Brian Wilson became more experimental and wanted to shed that poppy sound, that image, and it pretty much laid the groundwork for the Beatles and Sgt. Pepper's. I believe in previous interviews, Paul McCartney has stated that album inspired them to do Sgt. Pepper's. Then I went back and listened to the Beatles catalog from the debut all the way up to Let It Be. And I found myself more of a fan of their earlier stuff, like around Help and the White Album, Rubber Soul. That era of the Beatles was pretty much groundbreaking for me. And Lennon and McCartney, in my opinion, best songwriting duo ever.
I agree with you. I'm not going to fight you. I'm not going to fight you on that point. That's really interesting to me. No one, like I've been talking about this book and boy bands like for my whole life. It feels like no one has ever actually asked me about the Beach Boys. That's something I'm going to sit on and I'm going to discuss, and then you'll have to have me back and I'll have all these opinions on it. But yeah, the Beatles are really interesting to me because I think like in a lot of ways, they are also sort of the foundation of this. Rock and roll fans really hate when I say that because they like to think like, because there's still like a sort of stigma sometimes around like a boy group because it seems like infantilizing or limiting of like who your audience is and what you can do creatively. But like young women love the Beatles more than anybody else and sort of created their career. They had those uniform looks. They had those juicy harmonies. A lot of the Beatles songwriting, I think, feels like it's straight out of Motown. Like I know that they loved like the Supremes. They love those like women vocal groups, and that kind of informs their songwriting, which I think too is sort of part of this story. But yeah, I definitely think that they fit in that tradition in a lot of ways. And then even, just the fact that we call their fans Beatlemaniacs, and now we call all, pop music fans some version of that, right? Like they all have an army name or whatever, a fan army name. So they're certainly part of that history.
Right. And then we could go further back to groups like Frank Alignment and the Teenagers, Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons, all those doo-wop groups that came out of the 50s, pretty much honed in R&B, and they pretty much had a dominant female fan base. But now let's forward it from New Kids. They not only inspired everything in the US, but they also inspired a man by the name of Nigel Martin Smith to create his own version of New Kids on the Block over in the UK, consisting of 5 men: Gary Barlow, Howard Orange, Jason Donald, Mark Owen, and Robbie Williams, collectively known as Take That. So why do you think Take That was so huge in Europe, but over in the US, Back for Good was their only hit, and they never really seemed to really break over here in America?
Yeah, it's interesting. And it's funny because usually the people who ask me this question are English or Australian. So kudos, or Canadian, really. So kudos to you for asking. I think there are a variety of reasons. The sort of boring reason is when they got their deal with Clive Davis and Arista in the US, it was like 1993, 1994 or something. And the Backstreet Boys were already formed. So it's like we were on to the next sort of thing. There's also at that time period, there's the weird thing happening in the US where like we want our pop groups to be American. Like we liked New Kids on the Block, we like New Edition, of course, then like Backstreet Boys and NSYNC come. There's something about like keeping it at home, with the exception of the Beatles, of course, but that at that point that's like 20-30 years in the past, right? So there's something about us like we want the like sort of American group or whatever. It's really interesting to me because I think of it, it's just like a strange point in time because like they had the hits. There's no reason that they shouldn't have been massively popular in the US. I think a lot of it is, it's pre-internet or internet being in everybody's home and on their phone, and perhaps there wasn't as much exposure. It's really, it's fascinating to me. And then of course, like I think by the time that America really wanted a boy band, sort of another boy band post New Kids on the Block. I should also say that I think I've noticed that there's this sort of trend that like when we have a group and we love them, when they break up or we lose interest, there's a period where there is like a couple of years where there isn't a big group on top, typically because people are a little bit exhausted or the girls that love them are now in college. There's like a little bit of a lag. And I feel like they kind of hit during that lag where it's like, we're not ready for the next boy group. And then of course, Robbie left. So I think at the time that like when America would have really been on board, the heartthrob left the band. What are you gonna do then?
Yeah, Robbie was the resident bad boy, but when I went back and listened to Take That's catalog, especially the Everything Changes album, the Nobody Else album, Pray, Sure, of course, Back for Good, Love Don't Live Here Anymore, great records. Gary Barlow could have had a great career as an AC artist here in America because his songwriting was super duper strong. But the reason why I mentioned Take That was because when they split, that led for two groups out of Orlando, Florida to go over and start cutting their teeth. And Shaq mentioned in the story how when Backstreet Boys and NSYNC was just getting started, that he had a home studio in his Orlando home that he was charging them $25 an hour to use his home studio, and that he could have had a chance to sign both groups to Twism. Now, with Backstreet Boys and NSYNC, what do you think was the two stark differences between both groups and what led to the massive appeal of both?
Oh my gosh, such a good question. But I have to stop you real quick and say, like, I love the Shaq anecdote because I remember the first time I read Lance Bass's memoir, all I remembered from it was like he met Shaq and he wanted to go to space. Those were like the two details that stuck out with me. But what's so fascinating about Backstreet Boys and NSYNC, and I say it in that order purposely because Backstreet Boys came first. The manager who created Backstreet Boys, this guy Lou Pearlman, also created NSYNC to compete with Backstreet Boys. There's this sort of famous quote he has where he says, like, where there's Coke, there's Pepsi. Somebody saw that he had a lot of success with Backstreet Boys, was going to create the competition, so he created it himself, which is sort of like a bit of sinister but really fascinating sort of music business history. Backstreet Boys are creative because this guy Lou Pearlman actually has an airplane business, which is kind of strange, and he rents a private jet to New Kids on the Block. And on one of these jets, he sort of has this conversation and he learns that they make a lot of money, specifically in merchandising, but, just by virtue of being New Kids on the Block. And he decides boy bands, boy groups, etc., seem like a good way to make money. I'm going to get into this, whatever. I also like handsome boys. Let's do this. And so he creates Backstreet Boys by putting out an ad in the local paper, the Orlando Sentinel, and gets this group together. These are guys who are performing at like Walt Disney World. They're performing at Universal Studios because, again, it's Orlando, Florida. And he builds this boy band with the help of Johnny Wright, who was the road manager for New Kids on the Block and then becomes a manager of Backstreet Boys and also NSYNC, perhaps the most influential managerial character in this sort of like teen pop boy band time period and musical phenomenon. And they blow up to enormous size. I think a lot of it is because Backstreet Boys, they were young, they were cute, they danced well, they sang well, they did a lot of ballads. They were really sort of performing in the style of like Boys to Men. The example I always use is listen to Backstreet Boys, I'll Never Break Your Heart, next End of the Road, and like Spot the Difference. They were really trying to be, the like white teenage boy version of Boys to Men, and it worked fabulously. They started, working with like Disney Channel and playing Planet Hollywood, and it sort of explodes. And then, a couple of years later, Pearlman decides, hey, I had so much success the first time, let's do it again, creates NSYNC. And sort of, I think they get the sort of benefit of being the second group where they can sort of see what the Backstreet Boys did really well and grow from it. So they become, I always consider them like a little bit more energetic. They have more of like the big pop songs. I mean, both of them obviously have massive, some of the biggest hits of all time in the history of recorded music ever, but they're a little bit more energetic. They're even more dancey. Backstreet Boys in comparison suddenly seem a little bit moodier. And when Backstreet Boys ends up having the best-selling album of all time with Millennium in 1999, something like 1.3 million records sold, No Strings Attached, the NSYNC album comes out a year or two later, and it's like 2.4 million sold in a week. so they're sort of direct competition, but kind of cut from the same cloth. And it's a really interesting time period because there are a lot of those music rivalries, right? Like in the teen pop, like female space, you see Britney Spears versus Christina Aguilera. And, it really, the Coke versus Pepsi thing really sticks with me because it was so of that time. Beyond, and then there are all the other copycat, or not copycat, but the other sort of smaller boy bands like LFO, Dream Street, O-Town, like you were saying.
Right. And I had a chance to interview Donna Wright, and she was pretty much telling me that when both groups were around being formed, it was like whatever Backstreet turned down, NSYNC got, because initially that Disney special was supposed to go to Backstreet Boys, but they felt, no, we're too old for Disney, but not knowing that's your demo. And that's what led NSYNC to really catch fire here in the US, and the rest was history. But I also want to mention how Sweden played an important role in the late 90s, early 2000s teen pop phenomenon, especially Sherman Pop Studios, the late Dennis Pop, Max Martin. And also I want to mention Herbie Kreislow. You can catch my interview with Herbie Kreislow on Beyond the Album Cover, where he talks about that whole history with Ace of Base and how that sound pretty much made its way stateside when Backstreet Boys and NSYNC broke big over here in America. So can we talk about the importance of Sweden and their musical influence on teen pop here in the US?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of exactly what you said. Chiron Studios, Denise Pop, Max Martin, who everybody knows now from like every big he's written with for like Taylor Swift, Katy Perry, like Rihanna, like all these sort of people, this massive pop songwriters. Yeah, it's that specific sound of that, like people always say 90s, it's more like late 90s, early 2000s pop music all comes from Sweden, from Stockholm. The sort of like angular like synth sounds, the very structure. I said earlier about this idea about musical math. That's a Max Martin-ism, where he sort of can construct a song based on like, you need to hit the chorus at this many seconds into a song, you need to repeat the third lyrical line. It's very particular, which might make it sound limiting or constraining, but it actually has the opposite effect, where it gives you sort of this framework in which to write these incredibly huge hits. I'd also say that like beyond sort of Sweden, there's such a story of like Western Europe in the boy band story, because for a long time, and this is something like the Backstreet Boys and NSYNC and groups of this time period have said in many interviews kind of ad nauseum, in the early 90s, it really felt like there wasn't, right after New Kids on the Block, there wasn't a huge space for boy bands. I mean, this is the time where like Nirvana's around, grunge is big, and we're also seeing more like mainstream sort of white radio acceptance of hip hop and rap music for the first time. And so it didn't seem like these like incredibly sort of saccharine, like jovial boy bands had much space. So they went to Europe, where in particular, Germany has always been very like embracive of boy bands. They've always loved the kind of like cute young like boy, especially Americans. They like that sort of image, so they're very popular there. So that's one of the reasons why Perlman kind of sent them to Europe, because they were like, this is where the space is, figure out your stuff here, and then when it works, come to America and do your thing. And then of course you have these incredible pop songwriters in Sweden. They're becoming massively popular in Western Europe, and then they come back to America, and in the early days, no one's meeting them at the airport. They're unknown and they're huge in Europe. And then of course, like your friends at school aren't going to believe you. And then you have to do it all over again. But yeah, Sweden is it's interesting because it's always been this like incredible hotbed for pop songwriters. You look at any big pop release now, like that charts, you can look at the credits, and quite often there is a Swedish songwriter involved or a Swedish producer involved.
Right. Yeah, because we can go as far back as like ABBA and Roxette, and then we could look at the material with Robin and how her stuff, when it came out in America, predated what Britney and Christina did by a year or two, and she definitely had that pop R&B mold in the same vein of Pink, her first album before she got with Linda Perry and just went full-blown rock.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I always think of when I listen to maybe not the first Britney Spears album, but the second one. I'm like, I wonder if any of these like synth lines were written for Robin originally. And ABBA too. There's so much of that like call and response moment where like you sing a part, and then they sing a part lower or higher or whatever in a hook. That's so ABBA. That's so Swedish, and that is the bedrock of so much pop music of this time period, and also like K-pop in the sort of modern iteration as we continue down this history you're running us through.
But the one boy group who I felt should have been bigger, they were huge in Europe. They were the second biggest group in Europe next to the Spice Girls, famous last name and looks, but for some reason never really took off in the US, was 3T. And of course, they're the sons of Tito Jackson of the famous Jackson family. I mean, that Brotherhood album, I still wear that out to this day. And it was one of the early albums that had early writing credits by young Robin Thicke.
I did not know it was so massively popular in Europe. See, that's a great thing also about this history is there's always some bands that are going to be a little bit of a blind spot.
Yeah, which is crazy because I mean, your last name is Jackson, your uncle's Michael, your aunt Janet, your uncle's Jermaine. I mean, you come from the first family of pop, and how did it not really
Yeah.
translate in America to success is mind-boggling to me. And then another group, we're going to go into underrated boy groups.
All right, let's do it.
Two underrated boy groups for you that I don't know you're familiar with, but I think you should really check out.
I'm taking notes.
Barrio Boys, their How We Roll album, definitely to me sounded like an album Backstreet Boys probably would have came out with when they first dropped. They were put together by Joe Jacket. He was in the same camp with New Kids on the Block with Johnny Wright. Another one, I don't know if you're familiar with the group Troop. You should definitely check them out. They're my second favorite boy group of all time, right behind New Edition. And Steve Russell Hart's one of the members of Troop. He wrote records for B2K, who you mentioned in the book. He wrote
yes,
The Reason Why I Love You for B2K. He wrote Gas to Be for B2K. So if you like some of B2K's material, definitely check out Troop. I felt C Note was underrated. They were out of the Transcon camp, but I felt like they didn't do what they needed to do as far as taking them to maybe Latin America first, breaking them before coming over here to the US. And then another boy group, they weren't underrated. They were just one hit away from having a massive US hit. And they had the chance to be one of the most successful, I think, British boy groups in the US next to the Beatles, was Five.
Yes. Yeah. I'm sure you know this, that Bye 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 was originally written for Five. And the original version of the song had a rap section. And then the folklore is that Justin Timberlake was like, no, we don't need that. But I don't know. I'm sure it was like somebody in Sweden who like realized kind of quickly on. But Five had a lot of, there's so many, especially like the British boy bands that I'm sort of shocked weren't more of a presence, even like Boyzone, in the US. It's just but I guess you sort of have to also think of the time period where like people, it was way easier to be a little bit more limiting based on your region. We weren't as curious about music globally. And I just want to like double down on what you said about C Note, because I agree with you. Cause I think if anybody could have broken a Latino boy band, you think it'd be Perlman. He's like having success with all these bands. He created Making the Band with O-Town before Diddy took over or whatever. It's really, you would think that he would have figured it out, but it's absolutely what you said. Like the way to do that would have been take him to Puerto Rico, take him to Venezuela, take him to Mexico, break him down in Latin America, and then bring him back.
Right. And I still have the Different Kind of Love CD. And also this group I felt got overshadowed because of the success for I Want to Sex You Up. But if you go listen to the Time and Chance album, Color Me Bad was something serious. Brian Abrams could sing his face off. You can catch my throwback interview online with Kevin Casey Thornton from Color Me Bad. But like I said, I Want to Sex You Up pretty much overshadowed vocally and look-wise what Color Me Bad did. Because think about it, early 90s, I think America really wasn't ready for a multiracial boy group.
They certainly weren't. Yeah, I also love Color Me Bad, but in my mind, and this is definitely because I was like a child then, I was like, they were more mature. And then, like at that point in time, I'm like a little kid, I'm the boy band audience, right? So it's like, if it's a little bit mature, then you maybe don't get cast into this tradition. And by that, I mean simply just like the word sex, is intimidating for kids. But yeah, they had hits for sure. They had hits for days.
Right, because when I interviewed KT, he was telling me that because of the success for I Want to Sex You Up, Cassandra Mills, who was the head of Giant, was telling them, hey, you guys got to get in the studio, record an album, because people weren't buying the soundtrack. They were just gobbling up the single, and they recorded their debut album, CMB, I think 6 weeks time, and they had hits off that album, such as, of course, I Want to Sex You Up, All for Love, Thinking Back, I Adore Me or More. And, like I said, the look was unique for the time. Vocally, they could sing like nobody's business. And that was a renaissance in that period of the early to mid 90s of male vocal groups. Like we mentioned Boyz II Men earlier, Color Me Bad, Shy, Portrait, Silk, H-Town, and Jodeci, and how, it wasn't really the traditional boy group per se, as far as look and aesthetics. It was more on the vocal side, because if you look at Boyz II Men, the Cooley High Harmony album, to me, was the better album than two. But they knew, like, hey, in order to have pop success, we got to have that big money song. And of course, that led to End of the Road and all their pop hits that they're known and loved for today. But I felt Cooley High Harmony was the better album. And it was one of the early albums that featured production done by a young Dallas Austin before he linked up and started doing work with TLC.
Yeah. Wow, I feel like I'm learning a lot from this conversation. You're really schooling me. It's really sort of interesting too, because I always think, and maybe this is something you've considered too, of these like records of this time period, all of the reasons why they didn't break in the way that it seems like they could. And listening back, do you think that like, if the conditions were different, if it was more like today and we're like more welcoming of like multicultural groups, we're like more welcoming, we're like more sex positive, or all these things, if they would have had like more success? Do you ever like wonder about? I'm just kidding.
Yeah, I think it would have been different for some of the groups if we were more open-minded and not all pro-America, because I was probably the only American bumping Westlife's album, because I thought Westlife was really dope. Like you mentioned Boyzone, created by Louis Walsh, which was the Irish answer to Take That, and Westlife was pretty much the answer to Boyzone. And speaking of groups overseas, I interviewed KG from the British boy group Emanate. They had a record called I Got a Little Something For You that was on the Bad Boys soundtrack, and they covered Happy by Surface. And we were talking about the different dynamics between how it was for a group, let's say like a Take That, and a group for them, which was consisted of 4 Black British boys, and how, when you're doing that type of music, especially over there, and given Britain's history with race and with Blacks, and how it's like, you stick to your side of the fence. You may be lucky if you may see a Black act on top of the pops.
Right. Yeah, I guess it's just, the same sort of behavior or mindset, just in different ways. And also it is interesting too, to think of like English acts at that time, because still, I mean, obviously they were having success and still were a little bit like regionalized, considering like how the US wasn't immediately embracing them. But it's still a time period where like, if their mark of success for them would have been to break in America. And I think that's like sort of changed in the last couple of years. And then of course, in at least this particular story of boy groups, and like the sort of the most mainstream acts of all time, that clearly changes with, One Direction, who are at least partially also thrown together by Louis Walsh from Westlife, and everything is so related. It's crazy.
Yeah, it's either Louis Walsh or Simon Cowell. And now we mentioned Menudo earlier, and you were in the HBO Max documentary Menudo Forever Young, which is great. But I saw all of it, as I won't spoil it for you. And I kind of felt RCA dropped the ball and pretty much taking Menudo's energy and fire from Latin America and breaking them in the US, where I thought it should have been easy as pie, where it was like, hey, see what New Edition's doing? Just take some of what New Edition is doing, add a little bit of Latin flavor to it, and boom, or at least take a look at what was going on with freestyle with Lisa and the Cult Jam and everything that was coming out of either New York or Miami with that sound, and boom, or to be like, hey, we're going to the US market. Let me just switch up all of the members and just get kids who are bilingual so I can tap into the English and Spanish market.
Yeah, I think there are so many. It's like you could play What If Forever with that group, because I just think there's so many issues. Whenever you like watch even, and in that documentary, but it's like very easy to find too on, you know, on like YouTube or whatever, like 60 minutes clips of like, you know, some of these like famous news anchors talking about like Menudo, the phenomenon. And it's very clear that like the sort of mainstream, and I'm going to say in air quotes, like sort of white America really did not know what to do with Menudo. And when I say that, I mean, you know, because of like boy bands, traditionally the biggest ones in America have been white for a variety of reasons, namely their race. But with Menudo, it really seemed like they were sort of like cast as this like other phenomenon, this like sort of novelty act, when in fact they were together for 30 years. I mean, with many different iterations, but they were such a phenomenon on their own, but they weren't treated as like what they were just thought of as like, oh, maybe it's a version of the Beatles for Latin America. Isn't it interesting to see it here? And then you see all these like clips of these girls like losing it. They're so excited. And like, you know, especially in like, you know, like the like in some of the barrios and in Puerto Rico too, but like in the US and any sort of Latin music communities. And it's not just Spanish singing, Spanish language fans or English speaking fans who are falling in love with this group. And it really just seems like they weren't even at the major label like approaching them in a way that made any real sense. I mean, they did at least have the foresight to, for most of the time, have a member who spoke some English, not all of the time, and that's in different iterations of the band. But it really just is so crazy to me how much they've kind of fumbled the ball, for lack of a better term. And that is also something that I think in like the sort of modern era, K-pop was able to understand immediately. There is no K-pop act that breaks in the US that does not have a member, a leader, like the front person who speaks English, like conversationally enough to like sort of speak for the whole group. Right. It's fascinating.
Right, because when I look at Menudo, and I kind of think sometimes, hey, maybe take The Right Stuff or Please Don't Go Girl, put it on Menudo. That would have been a smash hit, because when you look at Ricky Martin during that period, he was short. He kind of reminded me of Joey in New Kids, you know, very short, very Kubrick, and definitely angelic. And he was like the golden child during that period of Menudo, in addition to Robbie Rosa.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, Draco Rosa. Yeah, exactly. And that's like a key to like the boy band story, right? Like all of them have that now, and that is something that we sort of learned from Menudo. But yeah, it is. And then, you know, there's sort of the tragic exploitative figures behind the scenes, and so many complications that also become so much of this history. But yeah, it's funny, you know, when I was like telling people about the Menudo series, they're like, some people remember very distinctly how big of a phenomenon Menudo was, and you know, Menudoitis and all these ideas. And then other people, especially younger people, I'll have to explain it as like, this is the biggest group that Latin America has ever produced. And for some reason that makes me feel there's a certain tragedy in my mind in that, because they were around for so long. They were so big, they were so marketed. It really just like, I don't think the US like music marketplace knew where to make them fit in, which I do think is also a good parallel, at least a little bit for New Edition, because in my mind they should have been as big as New Kids on the Block. Obviously there are a lot of reasons why they weren't able to do that, but it's just like, if, you know, in the same way that New Kids on the Block was marketed on like, you know, at the time they were still using urban radio as the language of it or whatever, before that Florida radio station that put them on pop radio. Think about what would have happened if New Edition had the same opportunities. You know. Yeah,
because when I look at the Menudo merch, they were moving merch like New Kids. I mean, same thing, the dolls, they had cartoons. Pretty much, it was pretty much the same thing that New Kids was doing, but it was on the Latinx tip.
Yeah, absolutely. And feels very, and I'm happy that like we live in a time where we're like talking about their story now and what they were able to do, because you gotta remember, they started the first iteration of Menudo in in 1977. That's, and
Mm.
like New Edition 1978. It's like it predates what a lot of people think.
Right.
Quite the phenomenon.
Right, but it was very creative. And Eduardo Diaz said, "Hey, to keep the group fresh and to stay forever young, swap them out at 16." And how Menudo laid the groundwork for what was to later come with, the Latin boy groups like we mentioned Barrio Boys earlier, CNCO, even the success for the likes of, let's say today, Bad Bunny. Even though he's not in a boy group, his success wouldn't have been possible with Menudo laying the groundwork.
I agree. Yeah. And I would also say like Aventura, because there's like Romeo Santos, who's like Dominican and Puerto Rican and all that sort of stuff. Yeah, there's definitely sort of a long history of that. I love the connection because I connect Menudo and Bad Bunny all the time. So thank you for that one.
Right. Now, back to Backstreet Boys. I had a chance to see them live for the first time last month in Albuquerque. And man, they still got it. And it's crazy to believe that next year will be 30 years for Backstreet Boys together.
30 years.
1993,
yeah.
2023. It's crazy. Almost 30 years.
Oh, I'm so glad you went to that show because I've also went to the store because it's the DNA tour that's been put off because of COVID, obviously. But yeah, I saw it too. And I was out in LA for work stuff. And I saw them at the Hollywood Bowl and I'd never been, and they were amazing. I was like, dang, I need to start doing my my cardio so I can have as much energy as AJ.
Right. But it's crazy. Like vocally, they still sound sharp. And we mentioned 98 Degrees briefly, but I want to go back to them. I had a chance to interview Jeff Timmons and how their whole get up and mindset was when they first came out. We want to pretty much do what Boyz II Men is doing and pretty much add our own flavor to it. Because that debut album, solid R&B, one of my favorite albums. Nick Lachey, vocally, is a problem. If you have not seen Masked Singer when he won it, you got to look at it. But 98 Degrees, like New Kids, at the core, R&B. But then, of course, once label head switched, they saw what Backstreet Boys was doing. Was like, hey, we're going to steer you guys towards the pop realm, but at the end of the day, they're an R&B group at the core, pretty much.
Absolutely. I think that's like, I think that's a trend that you're identifying where it's like the best or like the strongest vocal performers in this space are typically the ones that come from R&B. Right? It's like because they know, they just know harmonies better than, as much as I love me some like bubblegum pop, like some like lighthearted pop songwriting. It's those guys who could do those R&B harmonies that really know what they're doing, that have the strongest singers.
Right. And you mentioned K-pop. That was a phenomenon that took me by surprise, in how the group CO Taji, you may correct me on the last name pronunciation if I butchered it, in Boys, how they pretty much laid the groundwork for what was to come with K-pop, because you could tell that they were easy listening to everything that was coming over in America, that was out in the 90s, early 2000s, with New Jack Swing and incorporation of rap, and how they added their own flavor to that, and that laid the groundwork for what was to later come with BTS. Now, I felt Big Bang should have been the first, because Bad Boy,
I'm with you.
I think had Bad Boy would have gotten a hold, I think Big Bang would have had the same success that BTS has had. Because to me, it felt like the whole K-pop scene and the entertainment companies that put those K-pop groups together, it kind of felt like what Motown was doing, but on steroids.
That's exactly right. All of that was perfectly put. I think it's also important to say that like K-pop, like in South Korea, they've always had their own like pop music. This phenomenon is fairly new. And a lot of the reason is because like in the 80s, South Korea was still under a dictatorship. There was a limitation on what kind of music you can listen to. So as soon as they get music, and we're in the 90s, everybody wants to, they are listening to rap for the first time. They're listening to R&B for the first time, and it's blowing their minds. And then of course, K-pop is sort of born out of that idea. Because it's sort of a new phenomenon, South Korean government is like allowing at least 1% of its state budget, which is still true to this day, to go to entertainment. There is actual government support of these industries, which is kind of interesting. It's always kind of blows my mind as an American, like to hear the government supporting the arts in a direct way like that. I know it's not so rare in some other countries. But you have this like infrastructure that's supporting all of these ideas. And then you have like the best songwriters, these companies who are going to try and mimic what has succeeded everywhere else in popular music. So what are they doing? They're looking at Motown. They're, for a long time, a lot of these groups were doing what Menudo did, what Eduardo Diaz created, which was replacing boys. And if they like didn't make sense in a group, or if they aged out or they became harder to work with, there was a lot of that kind of changing of the guard or something. A little less so when a group becomes very famous, because people tend to develop relationships with performers and all that sort of stuff. But they absolutely were pulling from all of that. I would say that the main difference is, at least in like the songwriting, is that a lot of the times, I remember when, especially even when Big Bang came out, because you're talking like second generation of K-pop groups. This is also when there are girl groups like Girls' Generation, which, and 2NE1, but it's spelled 2NE1, that produced CL. They're like getting Apple or like iPod commercials. Like this music was kind of in the periphery. People know Gangnam Style by Psy, but it's still sort of what feels like a little bit novel to American ears. But Big Bang, they were sort of setting them up to be the big like K-pop boy band that breaks in America. I just think that it wasn't the right time. I think like BTS succeeded for a lot of reasons, in particular because they made it a point to be in America a lot, and sort of American audiences like to be able to see, of course, the music that they love and feel that connection. And there's RM who speaks such fabulous English, and they all speak some English now too. But I'm sorry, I wanted to return to something earlier where you were saying it's like Motown on steroids. A lot of that is because of how mechanized the process is. A lot of these groups live together, they train together, they're sort of put together by people at a company, sort of listening to like, oh, we need like a bass here, so let's get this guy. Oh, this person's too old, he's in the other group. That kind of mentality. And then in the actual songwriting, these songs are kind of constructed where they almost sound like 3 songs in one. There's like an incredible amount of like hooks and tempo changes and all these things happening. I remember very early on in listening to K-pop, I was like, this sounds like this is an EDM song, but it's a hip hop song. But for some reason, there's this like gratuitous like guitar solo, and there are all these things happening. It's very maximalist, and now I love it. But when I remember when I first heard it, I was like, this is too much, which I think is true for a lot of things when you first hear it for the first time.
Right.
But yeah.
Right. And the one group that gave the green light for boy groups to really come back into effect in the US, but we don't look at them as a traditional boy group because they were self-contained as far as playing their own instruments, songwriters. I mean, Middle of Nowhere, a huge album, and it set the stage for what was later to come with the Jonas Brothers. Can we just talk about the impact of Hanson?
Oh gosh, yeah. Hanson is like very much their own, I feel like, contained kind of boy band in this story, where it's like they do play their own instruments, which was something we really hadn't seen unless you're like counting the Beatles, which I do, but a lot of people don't. So it's sort of this like rare phenomenon that's happening in the 90s already. They're brothers, which is, also something that happens quite a lot, but not too much, right? Like you see it with the Osmonds, obviously their family, and then you see it later with the Jonas Brothers. But Hanson's so fascinating to me because I kind of play around with the idea of them being a one-hit wonder in my book with Mbop, because that's the one everybody knows. But there are some diehard Hanson fans out here, and I've read all of their emails who disagree with me quite considerably. But they were certainly of that time, but I sort of see them as outside of it. And I've always kind of been interested into what that idea was. And it could possibly be that for a lot of boy band fans or boy group fans, they were sort of, by virtue of being instrumentalists, like more of like the pop rock leaning phenomenon at the time, where like a lot of the boy bands, as we said, were pulling more from like R&B pop. So there was that interest that kind of allowed them to occupy their own space. But yeah, Hanson's fascinating to me.
Right. And one group that I think was on the cusp of breaking big, but it was just wrong timing, was a group called NLT. They had a record called That Girl. And one of the members of that group later went on to be in Glee. I forgot his character's name. His character that he played was the one that was in the wheelchair. He was a member of that group NLT. So definitely check them out. And also another boy group that you should definitely check out would be Immature. They were put together by, of course, Chris Stokes, who later went on to put together B2K, and Immature featured Marcus Houston as the lead singer, who some of us know as Roger from Sister Sister. And I felt Immature, I think they were just one breakout pop hit away, because Never Lie kind of got pop play, but they never really had that one big pop record and that big pop success like B2K had. Because B2K, for me, I felt like they took the template of what New Edition did as far as R&B pop and carried it over, because B2K was huge.
They were huge, yeah, and that's like, I'm ready for like when they do the documentary series on B2K. I'm gonna be a huge fan. Yeah, in my mind, I've spent some time with Immature, but then, like when B2K happened, I was like, this is it for me. I remember dancing to it at like my middle school dance, or like a lot of B2K songs. But yeah, they should. I wish they would. Have they ever reunited? Now that I'm thinking about it, I don't actually know.
They did a reunion Scream tour a couple of years ago. All four of them: Raz B, Omarion, J Bug, and Lil Fizz. And like I said, that was my era of high school, so a lot of girls from that time period were at that concert saying, "You could take all my money." But I had mentioned Troop earlier, and how Steve Russell Hart wrote Gats to Be for B2K. When I interviewed him, he was saying that the label head of Sony was a huge fan of Troop and was like, hey, we want a record similar to Troop, but current for this group. And that's where Gats to Be for B2K came to be. Now, Troop, like I said, for me, they're up there with New Edition, because Troop vocally, sing their butts off, could dance their butts off. Take a look at the video for Spread My Wings. Legendary video. Is up there with If It Isn't Love, as to me, one of the best choreographed boy band videos of all time. They were the West Coast version of New Edition. While New Edition's dancing style was more in the same vein of Temptations, The Whispers, Blue Magic, the OJs, because that was what Brooke Payne, choreographer, and Ronnie DeVoe's uncle, was reared on. Troop took elements of that, but also added popping and locking and everything that was popular out in California, and they just had it be a massive success on the R&B side, but they just never really had that pop success like New Edition. I always felt Troop was unsung and very underrated in the eyes of many.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Is there, now that we're sort of talking about dancing and choreography, is there for you like a boy band that you kind of think of as like the premier, the best dancers? Because this is also a question I get asked kind of frequently, and it's always hard for me to answer, because it seems like there are some that are obviously great of their time period. But it's a little possible, because like now that I'm like sort of living in K-pop world, because it's 2022 and that's sort of the popular boy groups of the moment. Some of these guys can really dance, but it's because they're pulling from groups that you're mentioning.
Right. Like I said, for me, my top two would be New Edition and Troop, because if you look at the AMAs that the performance that New Edition and New Kids did, and to see BTS being in reverence of both groups and doing the moves and pretty much paying respect to both groups that laid the groundwork, and how, you go to a New Edition show and it's sell out, all 6 members still moving, shaking, dancing, like in their early 20s, and how, like I said earlier, individually and collectively, they set the standard for male pop and R&B groups. I mean, Bobby Brown's Don't Be Cruel was the best-selling album of '89, went diamond. BBD, solo massive success as a group, set the stage for male R&B groups and female R&B groups, because if you look at TLC's debut album, and their whole look and aesthetic was pretty much BBD. Ralph Tresvant and Johnny Gill. I mean, the list goes on and on of how many groups and artists New Edition has touched. And the same thing with New Kids, and how on the pop side, Backstreet Boys, NSYNC, pretty much everything pop and R&B wise came from those two groups.
Right.
And how absolutely nothing would be possible in the modern day pop without that. Because if you take a look at New Kids and think about what Maurice Starr did, here's this black man taking 5 white kids from Dorchester, R&B flavor, the whole camp It's all black. Dick Scott, the manager, black.
Mhm.
Robo, bodyguard, black. Johnny Wright, black. Joe Jacket, black. Everything, it was all black, but never did at one point. But back then, we kind of looked at it as, they're white and they get all black. But like, no, now
Right.
we're in a time in society where we're not as deeply focused about race as we should be. And how
Mhm.
they were saying, look, regardless of what we are, this is what we love. We grew up around it. If you don't like it, then you can go do something else. And Donnie definitely made that known because he was kind of like the spokesperson of the group and
Right.
was pretty much hammering home the point like, hey, this is us at the end of the day. This is what we love to do. We're not ripping nobody off. We're always paying respect, homage. We're doing it justice. And if you don't like us, then you can kiss the backside.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, say it again for the people in the back. I feel like I really do. I think New Kids on the Block has always been so good about that, and I wish more of these groups throughout like the boy group story were, or at least like more vocal about that. Which is interesting because sometimes I'll look at these K-pop groups or I'll talk to them, and when they're talking about like their musical influences in like Western musical influences, they're very rarely saying like Backstreet Boys and Sync, like a lot of the sort of mainstream press would lead you to believe. They're going back to like, they're mentioning Jackson 5. They're saying New Edition because they know where it all began. And they know, like, if you want to be a good dancer, you're looking at New Edition. You're not going to, I love the Backstreet Boys. You're not going to look at them as the best dancers, in this sort of tradition.
Right.
So yeah, I'm with you.
Right. And then another group who they were huge in the early 90s. They had a big pop hit with I Like the Way the Kissing Game, produced by Teddy Riley, the late Bernard Bell, and Dave Way. High Five, rest in peace, Tony Thompson. I felt High Five definitely were taking what New Edition did and was
Mhm.
going the pop route of it. And the Boys, another group who I felt was unsung and underrated, Down My Heart, Lucky Charm,
Mhm.
Hakeem Abdul Samad from the Boys, underrated as a producer, did remixes for Kevin Campbell, Shanice, production work on the Boys, and they now are the band the Sons of Light. And it just kind of feels like you said, every generation there's always going to be a boy group. But when everything came out with Lou Pearlman and what came out, it to me ruined it. Can't Not ruined, but tainted what was really a special time in music with everything that ended up coming out about Lou Pearlman.
Yeah, it's really hard to deal to stomach, and I've noticed that, like, especially, I mean, I think it's true like in all of the entertainment industry, but especially with this sort of phenomenon that we're talking about, because a lot of these groups that end up like sort of doing well or like getting in these deals or whatever, they aren't from like entertainment households, right? Like their family isn't or like a parent isn't like a famous actor or whatever. They're like kids from Kentucky or Roxbury in Boston or like Orlando, Florida, whatever it is. And then they get into these exploitative contracts, which in many cases hinders their ability to have success, like so many of the groups that you've educated me on. And I feel like you got to make me playlist. I'm really excited to dig in. I've only skirted the surface here. And so it sort of like limits their success. And then it also makes it really complicated to just kind of like, even in for some people, especially when you get a little bit older and you think about it, like enjoy listening to this music. Like I will always like a bop is a bop, but then it's complicated when I have to think of like, oh, but like what was happening behind the scenes? Like, is this person who's singing this like really carefree song about having a crush in a exploitative situation, God forbid, like an abusive situation? And that just happens time and time again with this sort of stuff. And that's also a question that I would get asked a lot with the book, is kind of like, well, how do you deal with knowing that when you're listening to pop music and or like this pop music? And the answer is sort of that's the case for all of pop music. You have to sort of make that choice of like, you love the record, you love these musicians, you want to support them, and they were in this horrible situation, and those things have to like exist all at once, I guess. I don't know. What's your take on it?
Right. It kind of like you got to separate what happened from the art, kind of like,
Hmm.
what's going on with R. Kelly. Like me personally, I can't listen to an R. Kelly record because of everything that's gone on behind the
Right.
scenes, and how
Same.
kind
Yeah.
of like knowing, with Lou Pearlman, what was going on behind there, and then of course hearing about the dark stuff that was happening with Menudo. Like I said, it just tainted a really special period in music when not everything was all squeaky clean like it was posed, behind the scenes. Because you got to think about it, a lot of these guys were in their early mid-teens, maybe early 20s, getting in these groups, and they don't know no better, sign these
Hmm.
contracts, and especially when you're not of age and the parents are pretty much signing over consent for these people to pretty
Right.
much be the representative on your behalf, and they're entrusting you to make the best decisions for them financially, physically,
Hmm.
making sure that they're not exhausted. Because I remember there was a story when NSYNC was cutting their teeth in Europe and how they were steady on the go, boom, 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 boom. And I believe it was Justin's mom put her foot down to the label and was like, these boys need a break. If they don't get a break,
Yeah.
we pulling the plug and we shutting this down.
Hmm.
And you got to have somebody
I,
like that in the corner to pretty much stand up, because if not, they'll work you to death.
Right, exactly. And that's also a situation in which, there NSYNC was very lucky to have Justin's mom and also Lance's mom went on tour with them in those early days too, because he was so young. But to have somebody, a figure like that is advocating for you, because then you also have situations where like maybe you're like 15 and or maybe even younger than that, and your parents are like, this is how we get a better life, you're given this incredible opportunity, and then you're both the kid and the meal ticket, and then maybe they're not as keen to sort of like vouch for you. It's so really complicated and sticky and harrowing, and it happens all the time, right? That's why we call them a cautionary tale. My
Right.
reading of it is always, that like I love this music and it's so much of like what makes me happy, and it's I've made friends from it, and now I get to talk to you and have this really lovely conversation about it, and I wouldn't trade that stuff for the world. What do I wish the conditions were better? Of course, it's so complicated. But I'm with you there. Like in a situation with like R. Kelly, I can't listen to that, but that's him being the or doing the abuses. It's like when it's the system, it's a little bit more complicated, I think.
Right. And when you're thinking about the sacrifices you make as teens to go into this industry, and we mentioned the New Edition miniseries, and just thinking about, Ralph, and the actor Algie Smith that portrayed Ralph, and how Ralph pretty much, it was always group first, where
Right.
he could have had the solo deal initially. It was like, nah, this is for the group. Everything, was for the group. And to think, you have 4 or 5 plus other guys, and how hard it is to kind of put your own ego aside, your own goals and wants aside, for the sake of the group. Not everything's going to be rosy. I'm sure every group has had like, okay, I don't want to do this, I don't want to do that, but I got to hold my tongue because it is a group effort.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is something too that like whatever a group like any of these groups, like when they like break up or decide to take a break or whatever. Now, I think a lot of it is just like after honestly NSYNC, the sort of assumption is that like somebody wanted to leave because somebody got too big for the britches or whatever. And I think it's kind of an unfair reading, because so much of it is so many of these guys who very much could have had that opportunity are making that sacrifice of sticking it out for the group. And I think that's what's kind of usually some of my favorite groups seem to, at least on the surface, operate more like a democracy where there is that sort of camaraderie, and you can tell, and it's great.
Yeah, because seeing, the crowd at the Backstreet Boys concert and how fans are still loving them kind of makes you think, hey, Justin, you're not doing anything, bro. Call up JC, call up Chris, call up Lance, call up Joey. Stop BSing. Give us what we want. Even if it's a 10-city tour, just give us something, man. I mean, imagine how much money you all would make if y'all were to say, we're going to do a tour. Y'all will break the internet. I'm
I
serious.
agree. I I get goosebumps. I got goosebumps from you saying that. No joke. I like I'm all for it. It's ridiculous that like when they do the mini reunion with Ariana Grande at Coachella, he's not there. I think it's time. It also would just be good publicity for him because people have been giving him a hard time, after all of the like Free Britney and the Britney documentary stuff when
Oh
they sort of
yeah.
saw sort of like some of the unfavorable, we'll say, PR decisions around like the Crimea River sort of solo Justified Justin era. I mean, it would only benefit him to reunite with NSYNC right now. Let's send him a
Yes.
letter.
Yes.
Someone tell
give us
Johnny
that.
Wright.
Give us that,
Yeah.
please give us that. And what I do want to mention though, like I said, Instinct still on hiatus, and you mentioned BTS is taking a break. Do you see BTS possibly going the Instinct route and taking an indefinite hiatus?
Here's the thing. It's almost impossible to know, but my answer, my like guess would be no. I think why this is happening now is for people who don't know, in South Korea, there's a mandatory conscription, like military service for all men. And it used to be that you had to do 2 years of like civil service or military service by the time you were 28. And unless there's some sort of like extraordinary circumstance, you're an Olympian, something like that. And in the case of BTS, they actually raised it to 30. Now their oldest member, Jin, turns 30 in December. So my think, and it's like South Korea, it's kind of a conservative society where like you wouldn't be able to like, just draft dodge for lack of a better term. It would be very disrespectful and looked down upon. So my thinking is they're taking a break so that they can, fulfill this. Like some of them will take turns doing the solo thing. The other ones will like do their service and then they will come back afterwards. That's what Big Bang did, or that's what they're doing now. So I think, but there's also some sort of controversy surrounding Big Bang as well. There always is I'm only laughing because there's so many controversies in all of these stories that we're talking about. But my thinking is that they will get back together. Or like, the break will end because of that reason. And also they make billions for South Korea a year. It would be so ridiculous. Like it would be kind of just a loss for them if they took a big break forever. And they seem to really like each other. So I don't know.
Right. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention BB Mac, because I was a huge fan of theirs, because I remember back here getting played a lot on Disney. So I thought they were really huge. And I don't know if Soul Decision out of Canada will be considered a boy band, but I thought that they were really dope as well. And we mentioned One Direction. And are you surprised at the fact that Harry Styles has pretty much has gotten as big as he has solely? Because when I look at Harry Styles, his style and his performance, to me, you could tell he really studied David Bowie.
He definitely studied Bowie, definitely studied Stevie Nicks, big Fleetwood Mac guy. Yeah, I guess like I am, you know what, it would be ridiculous to say that I'm not surprised. I mean, I love the guy and I have for well over a decade now. But I think he's done a really excellent job at navigating his solo career. He obviously has such natural talent and charisma, and a lot of it is talent and charisma. But the fact that he's been able to become so successful and appeal to such a broad range of people outside of like, One Direction fans or like rock music fans is really, really sort of impressive. And people compare him to like a Justin, or I mean, if he's lucky, like a Michael Jackson, it's like a big, huge, like a member with a solo career that kind of eclipses the group. But I don't know. He's just an interesting character. It's really been fun to sort of watch his career.
Right. And they came together on the UK version of the X Factor. Simon Cowell, Judge, like we mentioned, Five, because Five was Simon's attempt at missing out on the Spice Girls. And we saw what numbers the Spice Girls did. And there is a boy group. A lot of people, not surprisingly, but this man went on to have solo success when he dropped the album Faith in 1987. First album that was #1 on the R&B charts by a white artist, talking about Mr. George Michael. Because when you go listen to the Make It Big album, that clearly showcased that this man can't be contained. He can write and sing until the cows come home. And when Faith came out, that pretty much was like letting it all hang out. And then when Freedom 90 came out, blowing up the jacket, the jukebox, he's like, I'm gonna be more than just this pinup symbol. And do you think sometimes being in that type of group kind of restricts you when you want to try to venture out and say, hey, I've grown up, and you got to resort to kind of doing outlandish measures to kind of get that teen idol stench off of you?
Yeah, it's interesting because it's sort of like it appears that way with from like the wisdom of distance, I guess. Because in my mind, I'm like, I don't know if, I mean, George Michael, like, was he always going to become that? Maybe. I think there's definitely, you have to have that space. I always think of it as the like, not to be so like psychology about it, but like the individuation problem, where it's like when your identity is a group and you like have to figure out who you are, you experiment a little bit. We all do when we're like teens or in our early 20s. And it's interesting to see when artists do that and when they do it artistically, and like, but no one can touch him. Faith is incredible. Like, it's another level.
Right. So where do you see the future of boy bands? Do you think we'll continue to see the rise of K-pop? Do you think we'll see dominance of American groups? And with today's generation of kids listening to music genreslessly, will we see a boy group where we're not going to be straight pop, we're not going to be straight R&B, we're not going to be straight rock, we're just going to be a collage of what we like?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think like BTS like played with a lot of different genres, but like the biggest hits were the English language ones, which are pretty like retro-y synth pop, like very like shiny, like, I mean, they're talking about drinking a glass of milk. It's very PG, like pop, capital P pop music. I think with the future boy bands, K-pop is not going to go anywhere, but because of the way that we listen to music now, where it is sort of like separated based on like what you actually like, and that doesn't mean by genre, it's just like there's so many different communities that kind of live in their own corners of the internet. I feel like it could be anything. I think it would be something that's like the next big boy band will probably be something that plays with a lot of big genres, will probably have a couple big pop hits, but maybe they even have a country song. Like, who knows? The world is changing and growing. My hope and my biggest dream would be to see another huge Latino boy band, like, because it's been a very long time since Menudo. Everybody wants to be a reggaetonero like today, like even like Rosalia, and she's from Spain and she's not from Latin America, so like it would be fun to see like a big reggaeton boy band. I don't know, I get really excited by the opportunity to play with genres, play with cultures and languages in particular, because for the history of pop music, everyone who isn't an English speaker is listen to English language music. And it's interesting to see now, like, young people have the experience of like some of their favorite songs of all time being performed in other languages and being open-minded about that, which I think is so cool and exciting. So a lot of opportunities there. Yeah, it would also be fun to see like a group, like it's been a while since we've had a big group of both like men and women, like boys and girls. I think of something like S Club 7, which was sort of flashed in the pan in the 2000s.
Hold your phone. I read somewhere on the news today that they're supposed to be getting back together. Now I remember S Club 7, they had a show on Fox Family back in the day, and this was when they were trying to break over in America. So why do you think mixed groups have not succeeded here in America?
I have so many thoughts about this, and none of them are based on anything other than opinion. So like not well researched, just sort of thinking about it. I think a lot of it is people still kind of approach girl groups and boy bands as separate entities. Like if I had to flatten it in the way that they're marketed, girl groups typically have a message of like empower, like young girl empowerment. I mean, obviously girl power, with the biggest ones I'm talking about in America, like girl power, like the Spice Girls, or like independent women, like Survivor, Destiny's Child, right? And then you think of like boy bands. Boy bands are usually there to act as like the non-threatening boy that you can have a crush on, who won't do you any wrong, who's there to support you, make you feel good, act as an alternative to like the ruffians you meet on the playground, et cetera, et cetera. Those two things don't totally match up when you sort of mix them. So I think a lot of it is people, I mean, I loved S Club 7, and I'll bust it out at karaoke to see if people are on their toes. But I think a lot of like ideologically, like what they represent in the public, there hasn't been like a big message that people connect with. I don't know. I think it's about time though. I'm ready.
Yeah.
More of that, please.
I think it's about time for that. Another boy group you should definitely check out would be Another Level. They were definitely dope. They had the record Alone No More. Jay-Z was featured on it, and they covered Silk's Freak Me. Blue, they did a cover of Too Close by Next. They were at the point of breaking in the US, but what ended up happening was they were doing press, and it was around 9/11, and one of the members said something in the press that was insensitive because what was going on at the time in America, and that led to the US deal getting dropped, and that's what ended up happening with them. But I think it'll be interesting to see where boy bands will be going for the next 10-20 years, and maybe we'll get another Together, maybe we'll get another Monkeys, maybe we'll get another New Kids and New Edition. You'll never know. But real quickly, talk about any current projects you have coming out, and also give any shout outs.
Oh, sure. Well, the big one is I'm currently in production of turning the book into a documentary on superfans, boy band superfans. I'm working with XTR, which is the production company that did Ascension, which was nominated for an Oscar last year for Best Documentary. Obviously, they lost to Questlove and Summer of Soul, but they're an incredible documentary production company. Also working with Aggregate Films, which is owned by Jason Bateman. Their big thing is Ozark, but they're doing a lot of documentary stuff, so I'm working with them. It's directed by Gia Coppola, who is a Coppola, so it's very cool to get to work with her and like have a Hollywood family behind this project. And I'm really excited. Hopefully that'll come out in the next couple of years. So if you are interested in the book, but specifically you're interested in the enthusiasm of people who love boy bands and boy groups and pop music in general, and how it brings us together and it brings us joy and it soundtracks our lives, be on the lookout. Right now it's called Superfans, my gosh, Screaming, Crying, Throwing Up. It's a nod to the internet language. It's going to be really fun. As for, I should have shout outs. I didn't have shout outs prepared. I guess everybody I just mentioned, shout out my team, shout out everybody who has purchased the book, Hachette, Black Dog, and Leventhal, my publisher, my agents. They're both named Dana. They know who they are. I don't know. Shout out my mom for allowing me to pursue my passion when she very much could have not supported me. Shout out Puerto Rico, my homeland.
Puerto Rico. Oh, I got to throw that Frankie Cutlass in there. Also, plug your social media.
Oh, of course. Yeah. You can find me on Twitter and Instagram at Maria Sherm. My website is also mariasherm.com. Hopefully there will be some cool stuff on there. I'm very busy with the documentary, but it's been an incredible ride, and it's just so fun to get to talk about pop music with people who love it and live it, just like you, Jarrell. So thank you very much.
No problem. You can catch this interview wherever you stream podcasts and on YouTube at youtube.com/Beyond the Album Cover. So ladies and gentlemen, Maria says if she was in a boy band, she would be considered the bad boy. Me, I would be considered the quiet one. So ladies and gentlemen, let's give a big thank you, a round of applause for Maria Sherman for coming on to the podcast and breaking it down with me today. Maria, thank you.
Thank you so much. There's no way you're the quiet one. You're way too charismatic for that, but that's, I
would consider myself a mix of, I want to say, John Knight and Justin.
Oh, okay. I like that.
Yeah, thanks again,
I like
Maria.
that.